We have 25 minutes or so for panel discussion. And I guess before we launch into that, a couple of clarifying queries that have come through. And I don't, just to quickly go over those, and then we can dive into a more in-depth panel discussion. We have one question for Chase. I believe he's on the phone. One question that has come through from Kent Bradford at the beginning: along with the hermetic crop storage containers, are you discussing with farmers the need for also dry grains to save moisture content? I think that's missing a word, but any thoughts there, Chase?
Yeah, hi Eric, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, and apologies for the tech difficulties here. I would have liked to be able to join you by video. Great question. I mean, the hermetic storage devices that we're rolling out in the places that I mentioned typically come with some sort of training, of course, to make those things more viable. They also come with drying tarps. We use a pretty low-tech tool to be able to measure moisture content of the grain before it goes into hermetic storage. And that's typically, and I think that, I mean, this is very, very low tech. We typically use a water bottle, add a couple grains, add some salt, shake for a little bit, see what sort of clumping happens with the salt, or if any of it disappears. And that generally gives you a quick snapshot of moisture content. It surprisingly works quite well in the places where we've rolled it out. So I hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
Yes, thanks, Chase, thanks. A second clarification question is for Gabrielle from Lauren Prox. What are some of the actions that growers are being told to undertake in order to limit dust during almond harvest?
There's essentially two levels of approach. One is with current existing harvest systems, a lot of it is focused on making sure the orchard floor has been managed appropriately, making sure, let's say, the middle step, which is sweepers, where you take the nuts that have been shaken on the ground and put them into windrows, that you don't dig into the soil and loosen it up, because the dusty step is the next step to pick up. Speeds of fan speeds, blowing inwards, making sure you're not blowing outwards on the edges of orchards. So those are some of the things to do with current technologies. What we're really exploring now is moving to off-ground harvesting. So there you would not have that dust prone, but then it actually ties into the previous question. Then you need to figure out how to dry the nuts. I like to say we currently rely on solar power to dry the nuts, letting them lie in the ground. But there's other advantages, coming back to better quality almond hulls, for example, for alternative uses, by not having them drag through the dirt as much. And really looking at how do we move the system to an off-ground harvesting system to further reduce the dust. So those are the two key areas that we've been, one we have outreach on, the other one we're working on.
Thanks, Gabrielle. A third clarification is for Chris from Eric Kuhneman. Can you speak a little bit about optimizing mangrove ecologies for food and climate? Do you have a sense of what's happening globally on this important biome?
Thanks for the question, Eric. I'm not an expert on mangroves, so I can't give a clear perspective on sort of global status of mangroves, but you are right that habitats such as mangroves and seagrasses and oyster reefs and kelp forests all provide really critical habitats for juveniles in fisheries, and restoration efforts for those critical habitats will definitely bring about a lot of climate resilience. Something we found in my work is that really sort of well-managed fisheries, ones that have sort of robust populations of older individuals, are the most resilient to climate change, negative climate change impacts. So restoration of those key ecosystems is really critically important, and is important for coastal protection to protect land-based infrastructure as well.
Great, thanks, Chris. And also, if I may, just to jump in, I do have a kind of quick query for Tracy. So I just, I know questions are popping up, so I'm taking the liberty of jumping in myself here. You might have seen, just thanks for the presentation on the NCA. You might have seen that the 5th assessment, the National Climate Assessment call, is out. So
Yes.
I know you can't speak on behalf of the USDA, but from a personal kind of perspective, are the issues that you talked about in terms of rural poverty, land management issues, do you think those will continue to play a central part of this assessment going forward? What is the sense that you have on setting the stage in the previous assessment and what to take on for the next cycle?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for that question. I believe that agricultural and rural communities as a chapter on its own will continue to be included in the national climate assessments, because it's very different than the other chapters. The other chapters are more scientific and specific to different issues. There's also chapters that are regionally based that, focus on the regions. And the Ag and Rural Communities chapter is really the one that talks about this interrelationship between the economic and physical well-being of communities in relation to all the other natural resource bases and the economies that are impacted by climate change. So it really brings that connection between the kind of the human environment connection of climate change into the picture. And so, yeah, I think it will definitely continue to be an important chapter. And I'm also been working with FEMA on some things related to this, especially with regard to current disasters that have been happening, such as Hurricane Laura, as well as the ongoing concerns about COVID. And the community aspect of it is really in the forefront. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Just a little kind of point. The presentations today were sort of all talking about the human aspect of it, and the economic, and the operations of very particular sectors. And so we have a question coming in from Samantha Worth, excuse me. Thank you for all presentations. Where do you all see policy coming into play at local, national, and international levels for improving production systems across the different systems that you work in terms of functional, but also in terms of sustainability? I'm wondering, Gabrielle, do you have a?
I'll take a first stab.
Yeah.
And it may not be the most popular one, except for the academics in some ways, but as I noted in my presentation, we really need to make sure we have the investment in both the research side and the extension side. And certainly extension has been weakening. California has been hanging on, but it's still been weakened because there has not been investment in it. There really has not been investment in it. And so I just cannot overemphasize that as a key component to being able to adapt to change is having research of that research finding to growers to get to adoption. So that would be one area that I would put out there. And then the other one is certainly in the realm of incentives, figuring out how to, like in the case of NRCS, that's a longstanding and good program. I have to admit, sometimes the practice is a little bit Midwestern crop biased for those of us who work in California with specialty crops. But the other key issue there is there's actually income limitations that hurt the ability of specialty crops to work with that particular system, the way it's set up. And so I think there's some areas there where I would like to see some policy changes about how do we help growers with some of those initial uncertainties or adoption of new practices where there's a lot of learning going on. That would be the other arena.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I guess same question I posed to Tracy. Some of the areas that you work in are not, I might be grossly overgeneralizing, but are not terribly known for proactive climate disaster work. I might be totally mistaken. So what are the different policy levers in your view to enable some of the climate and disaster work in the communities that you're researching in? No.
Eric, I couldn't tell whether you were directing it at Tracy or Chase, but this is Chase.
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in on this one as
Oh,
well.
sorry, that was yeah. That was
I got it right.
Tracy first, yeah, but
Oh,
yeah.
go ahead, Chase.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Well, let me just say this. I mean, we, the World Food Program, obviously I wear a different hat than I did in previous days, but I can tell you that the policy environment, at least in the developing world, has evolved pretty dramatically over the past decade. I mean, we started out with things that we called national adaptation plans of actions. We've evolved into more short-term interventions and medium-term interventions through national adaptation plans. We've seen countries like Nepal pick up local adaptation plans of action to be able to feed up into that policy process. So I think that there's good mechanisms out there, especially in the developing world where you've got so many producers, smallholder farmers that we're trying to transition to climate smart practices. These are places that are marked by very persistent and long-standing poverty, places where you're not going to move support for these climate smart agriculture practices unless you're able to demonstrate productivity gains or be able to supplement and subsidize the activities that smallholder farmers are undertaking around the world. So just to say that I think these things have evolved a lot over the last 10 years. There's some good plans in place. A lot of developing countries are standing up national adaptation plans to be able to support smallholders in that way.
I can piggyback on that a little bit if you want, Eric, in response to your question. I can't speak to specific policies, but I think the part of my presentation that might not have come through very strong, but is really important, is the aspect of poverty in rural areas in America. And oftentimes when we think about that issue, we think about other nations and not specifically in the US. And it is a fairly big issue in resource-based communities, especially in agricultural communities, because when you have economic issues within an entire community, such as a lack of investment in infrastructure, roadways, water systems, housing, education, when that is an issue at the community level, and that community is very closely tied to the natural resource-based economy, those vulnerabilities and problems that exist at the community level kind of transfer over to the food and agriculture sector as well. So they're very much interrelated. And, there's always policy that is that's being proposed or activated that relates to different aspects of poverty at the community level. And it's kind of an ongoing challenge, kind of forever throughout our history. So it's something that exists and that calls for attention continuously. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Chase. Along the same lines of I guess, policy, there's a question that's come in from Andrea Thompson for Chris. It's about sort of the international cooperative area, because a lot of the fisheries and marine ecosystems that you touched on are transboundary. So what are the kind of policy implications of trying to work with all these different kinds of governments?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrea. I think it is a major hurdle. There's been some work reviewed a sort of census of all the global treaties about fisheries, fisheries sort of management, and found that there's no language in those treaties about climate change. And they've published that work, and I think it's actually a little bit of an overly sort of pessimistic outlook on how the fisheries management community is doing adapting to climate change. Because we do have international groups, for example, like all of the tuna and highly migratory species are governed by these organizations called regional fisheries management organizations, which are already sort of dealing at international scales. And US and Canada has some sort of co-managed transboundary stocks, and Europe is also sort of co-managing a bunch of their fish populations. So it is going to be a major hurdle, but I think there are lessons to be learned from efforts that have been going on for decades already.
Thanks, Bruce. Let's see, one more clarification for Chase, again from Eric Kuhneman. Thanks for the intro to World Food Program and its role in scaling up strategic innovations. Is the World Food Program linked up with the Global Evergreening Alliance that pulls expertise from delivery focused on regeneration of forests and farmlands?
Sure, and thanks for the question. Off the top of my head, I simply don't know. This is something that I can certainly check with my colleagues in Rome on to see if there's an existing relationship there. But if not, I would love to learn more about this. You have the contact information, the Zoom call. Why don't you drop me a note and we can connect on that. If you think there's some sort of way to be working together on these issues, we're happy to pursue it.
Thanks, Chase. Just if I may, just picking up on the partnership. A question for Gabrielle from me is from the Almond Board's perspective, you mentioned the partnership with extension and research community. Are cooperations with other sector specific boards, agencies, departments, have you had conversations with others that to try to further agricultural resilience, land management, or kind of economic incentives with different types of crops?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple different examples. So certainly, like we've worked with EDF, getting a grant to assess, could we get some kind of carbon credits related to nitrogen management? In the end, the data wasn't strong enough, but that was an example of where they had a goal, we had a goal, we worked together. Similarly, we've worked with Sustainable Conservation on recharge, groundwater recharge, and water issues. Just so those are some of the, let's call them non-governmental partnerships that we have. Then some of the larger partnerships. So currently been working with the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, ESMC, which is a nonprofit group working on trying to develop what I call private sector or carbon markets, or not just carbon, but ecosystem service markets related to carbon, water quality, water availability, maybe biodiversity. And that encompasses food companies, people that supply the ag industry and other ag groups across the country. Can't remember if Canada, I think Canada's part of that mix too. So those are some of the examples. And then, certainly I see a question there about local. For us in almonds, 80% of the almonds of the world are grown in California. They're not going to be all eaten in California. So, certainly there's also conversations going on with other, let's say, dried fruit and nuts organizations, or working on some issues, like on the sustainability space in general. There's been a lot more conversations with CPG companies and so forth, trying to understand what they want, figuring out how we can develop partnerships there. So I think there's a whole range of government, NGO, and private sector partnerships that we've been engaged with.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Another question that's come through, just on building off, because Gabrielle, you mentioned ecosystem services. Chris, you also did mention ecosystem services in your presentation. Is there thinking, this question is maybe for Tracy, is there thinking about ecosystem services or even payment for ecosystem services for the rural poor in general across the US? Are you aware of that discussion?
To ask for some clarification on that question, because I'm not exactly sure what specific payments, what the question, maybe a little bit more information on it would be helpful.
Yeah, so if Eric, you can type in a clarification, we'll come back to that.
Thank you.
No problem. And so just a question from Caitlin Lelis, for everybody. When discussing climate resilience, I think it's important to discuss nutrition and access. How do we better promote the purchase of whole foods straight from farmers? It seems a bit absurd that more highly processed foods are often less expensive. Just curious on any thoughts to that end. Who wants to jump in? Gabrielle.
I'm just going to jump in, though. I make no claim to be an expert in this arena, and I believe next week's sessions are going to focus a bit more on exactly these questions, so I'll defer to them. But I think one of the tensions here is it's actually a very complex question, but I think one of the tensions here, and this comes back to, I think also the question for ecosystem services, is at the end of the day, and I think Tracy pointed out that a lot of rural communities tend to be on the poorer side economically, in the United States at least. So how do you get more of that value back to the farmer and then more back into the local economy? Those are some of the questions that could help with that. They don't address it fully, but could help with that. But there's been this real tension between trying to make sure food stays cheap, period, and the needs of the rural community. And that I think is, I mean, Tracy probably knows more about that than I do, but that's, I think, to me, part of the conundrum here.
Thanks. Thoughts? Or Chris? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. So actually, these sort of systems have been one of the really sort of innovative, sort of creative adaptations that fishermen in the United States have had in response to COVID, where the majority of US caught seafood was being sold to restaurants before. And as soon as restaurants were closed down, many fishermen responded by doing much more direct to consumer sales. I live in Santa Barbara, California, and one of our local fishermen figured out a system where he was able to buy the catch of all the other vessels in port and sell them directly from his boat, and has been looking into getting a van to do door-to-door servicing for that. So I'll be excited to see if those sort of new strategies persist if and when this is all over.
Tracy,
I'm also happy to jump in here from
Yes,
the international perspective.
Yes.
This is Chase again. You know, I think from our perspective, I look around and do a lot of work in West Africa and East Africa, and these are places when we talk about kind of the nutrition problem around the world, and we tend to think of it in places like the United States, where we have really rampant levels of obesity and non-communicable diseases associated with improper nutrition. But these are problems that we're facing and seeing internationally at pretty significant levels now. A lot of countries are facing the sort of dual burden of undernutrition and growing levels of obesity. And a lot of that has to do with the advent and movement of highly processed foods in urban areas and places across sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So, a big part of what we're doing at the World Food Program too is trying to expand procurement from smallholder farmers in the places that we work. I mentioned at the outset and during my presentation that WFP does a huge amount of procurement, millions of metric tons of food in any given year. Typically, we do a lot of that. We maybe get between 1.5 and 2 million metric tons from the United States and a fair amount from other donor countries. But we're trying to increase the amount that we produce so that we procure from smallholder farmers in country where we're working, using our procurement platforms. And again, that question of economies of scale to be able to really leverage and expand support for smallholder farmers in the places where we're working. We're also, WFP is the single largest non-governmental provider of school meals on the planet. And so we're reaching 15 or 16 million kids every year in 50 or 60 different countries. And we're doing a lot of trying to take steps, and I've seen this happen in the United States as well, linking local producers to school meals programs as well. So hopefully those are a couple explicit examples internationally for you.
Thanks, Chase. Yes, Tracy, you unmuted.
Sure. I just wanted to comment as well on that question. As far as, USDA, they have every number of programs with, just for the sake of trying to address that question about, farm to table type of concerns to light and to helping communities to do that. And, I think that there's any number of challenges that always exist. And now COVID is one that has come in that is an issue for all of the farmer and market initiatives over the last several years. There's the VegU program, which works through the farmers markets to help people to learn how to grow, pick and prepare and store fresh food. So I think it's an ongoing question that is policymakers are continually seeking to address. And at my agency at ERS, we provide a lot of information that those policymakers can use. For example, we track food insecurity and identify where that is an issue and to what extent. I work on the issue of food deserts, identifying communities where they have limited access to grocery stores that have quality and affordable fresh food. So yeah, I just wanted to chime in and say that, you know, USDA is continuously working on this. Thank you.
Thanks. And as you're still unmuted, just on our question about environmental services, some examples came through from Eric about planting trees, application of conservation agriculture as possible services, maybe moving resources into the hands of poor communities, maybe also use of cryptocurrencies. Any thoughts on any of those points?
I'm not 100% familiar with those things, so I'm not really certain how I can answer that, except that, you know, I will take a look at some of those things and give some thought to it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
I know we're getting up on time, and so if I'm wanting to give you some a minute or two for some closing comments, kind of on reflection of the discussion, kind of what are the key takeaway points that you feel like we should take forward if we're interested in enabling climate resilience in agricultural food systems. What do you think the one or two things that as practitioners, as researchers, as business leaders even, what is the main message that you want to come through from the conversation we had today?
I can comment first.
Please.
I think for me, it's that you have to consider the other challenges that communities and sectors are facing that may or may not be related to climate change, that they may impact their ability for to respond and to maybe bring in some of those technologies for adaptation. And so that it needs to be more of a systemic approach that considers all of the things that are of challenges that climate change just plays into.
Okay, thanks. Other closing comments?
I just want to second what Tracy said, and I think, and that's part of, I think, of the point of the series is just that reminder of the complexity of these systems we're dealing with. You know, fisheries is completely different from a Mediterranean climate with a fairly advanced technology from a sub-Saharan farming system. So making assumptions that what you know works here, works somewhere else in that same way, probably not, but the question becomes, can the thinking be adapted to these different conditions? So I really would encourage that stepping back and saying, how do we take the philosophy and bring it to bear without assuming that we know best?
Thanks. I think with that, I will take the liberty of closing the conversation because Sandra does have one extra slide. I just want to say thank you again to Tracy, Gabrielle, Chris, and Chase for spending time with us. This was a fantastic discussion. I hope that was the same for you. Thank you again. And if we get more questions in the future, I hope I can just send those directly to you and start a conversation that way. Thank you again. Really appreciate everybody's time. And just a final note about next week, we do have our final fourth session coming up. That's more about equity and participation and inclusion. And we have these esteemed panelists and presenters coming through next week. And with that, I will close. Thank you again to everybody. Really appreciate all your effort and time. And let's keep this conversation going offline. Great.